She entered the concert hall quietly, moving in a gentle way that did not draw attention. The room was grand, filled with chandeliers, velvet seats, polished wooden floors, and people dressed in elegant clothes. Everyone seemed to know each other, talking loudly, laughing, and comparing their children's musical achievements. But the modest woman walked alone, holding her small handbag close. Looking for an empty seat where she could sit without being noticed, she chose a place in the back row. Far from the bright stage lights and far from the confident families in the front, she sat down softly, folding her hands in her lap, and looked around with calm eyes. No one greeted her, no one asked her name, no one wondered why she was there. To them, she was just another quiet face in the crowd, someone ordinary, someone without importance. The hall filled with the rustling of programs, the tuning of instruments, and excited whispers from young performers. Some children wore shiny shoes and practiced hand movements in the air. Their parents watched proudly, bragging about how many years of lessons they paid for. The modest woman listened silently, not judging, not reacting, just observing. A group of girls nearby noticed her simple dress and plain hairstyle. They whispered to each other, wondering if she was lost. One even said she must be someone's relative who did not understand music at all. The modest woman heard them, but her eyes stayed soft. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She simply breathed slowly as if she was used to being overlooked. The announcer stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. The crowd clapped eagerly, but the modest woman only smiled faintly. The first young pianist walked out proudly and played with fast fingers and sharp movements. The audience clapped loudly, praising the performance with excited voices. The modest woman listened carefully, hearing both the skill and the nervousness hidden inside the notes. More performers followed, each eager to impress. Some played loudly, some played dramatically, some looked at the maestro to see if he approved. The maestro himself sat near the front, his expression serious, his eyes focused, his posture straight and strict. People watched him more than they watched the performers, hoping for a nod, a smile, a sign of approval. But the modest woman watched differently. She listened to the music instead of the reactions. She understood something deeper, something the others did not hear. She heard the effort, the pressure, the competition inside each song. She heard how the music tried to be perfect instead of honest. As performers came and went, the modest woman stayed still in her seat, her breathing calm, her face peaceful. Yet her eyes carried a quiet depth, a depth that hinted at a story no one asked about, a depth that suggested she once belonged to a world these people could not imagine. The family sitting beside her adjusted their expensive coats, trying not to touch her, as if her simplicity might stain their elegance. A man in the row ahead glanced at her and then looked away quickly, surprised she was even there. The modest woman did not mind. She had spent years learning how to exist without taking space, without demanding attention, without expecting kindness. A memory passed through her mind, a memory of another piano hall long ago, a time when she stood on a stage instead of sitting in the shadows, a time when music flowed from her hands like water, a time before life changed, before sorrow closed the piano lid in her heart. She blinked and the memory faded, replaced by the sound of another performer. The hall grew warmer and noisier as more people arrived, but the modest woman stayed quiet. Her presence was like a soft candle in a room full of bright electric lights, unnoticed but steady. The maestro glanced around the audience once, his eyes passing over her without stopping. He did not recognize her, though. Once, long ago, he might have. The recital continued, applause rising and falling like waves, yet the modest woman remained untouched by the noise. She waited, not for attention, not for recognition, but for something she could not name, something that felt like a quiet pull deep inside her. She did not know that fate was moving toward her, slow but certain. She did not know that soon the room would look at her with different eyes. She did not know that the same people who ignored her would sit frozen when her hands finally touched the piano keys. For now, she was only the woman in the back row, simple, modest, invisible to everyone, yet holding a melody inside her that the world had forgotten, a melody waiting to awaken, a melody that would soon change everything. The recital continued and the modest woman stayed in her seat, quiet and calm, but the people around her grew more talkative. A pair of wealthy mothers leaned toward each other, whispering loudly enough for her to hear. One of them said she must have wandered in without an invitation. The other laughed softly and said she probably did not even know how to read music. The modest woman kept her eyes on the stage, pretending not to hear, but the words pressed against her heart like cold fingers. A group of teenagers dressed in fancy recital outfits turned to look at her. One girl wrinkled her nose and said her dress looked like something from a charity shop. Another boy smirked and said she must be someone's nanny who came by mistake. Their giggles rippled through the air, sharp and careless. The modest woman folded her hands tighter in her lap, breathing slowly, trying to keep her calm. She reminded herself that silence was not weakness, She reminded herself she did not come here to impress anyone, but the sting still reached her. An older couple sitting nearby glanced at her with puzzled expressions. The woman whispered to her husband, saying she didn't look like the kind of person who appreciated classical music. He nodded, agreeing without knowing anything about her. The modest woman lowered her gaze, feeling the familiar ache of being judged by appearance alone. She wanted to disappear into the chair, into the shadows, into the soft darkness behind the stage curtains. The announcer introduced another young performer, and the room shifted its attention back to the stage. The child played loudly and fast, fingers striking the keys with force meant to impress. The audience clapped with enthusiasm, praising the speed rather than the feeling. The modest woman listened carefully, hearing how the music lacked emotion, how the notes sounded empty. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered how the piano once felt beneath her own hands, warm, alive, full of breath and soul. When she opened her eyes again, she saw a woman in a glittering gown staring at her. The woman raised an eyebrow and asked if she was in the wrong section, implying she did not belong among the refined listeners. The modest woman answered softly that she was fine where she was. The glittering woman turned away with a dismissive sigh. The whispers continued, flowing like a cruel river around her. People exchanged assumptions as if she could not hear them, as if she did not exist. One man said she looked like she worked in a bakery. Another said she probably came to watch because she had nothing better to do. The modest woman felt her chest tighten, but she stayed still. She had spent years learning how to absorb humiliation without breaking. Suddenly the doors opened and more guests entered. A wave of perfume, expensive fabrics, and confident footsteps filled the aisle. A young pianist brushed past the modest woman and said she should move if she didn't understand recital etiquette. The modest woman apologized softly, even though she had done nothing wrong. Her eyes drifted toward the stage again, searching for comfort in the polished wood and shining keys. The maestro entered the hall at that moment, and a hush spread instantly. People straightened, eyes widened, backs stiffened. The maestro was famous, respected, feared. His presence demanded admiration. He walked with slow steps, his coat flowing behind him like a dark river. He sat near the front, his face stern and unreadable. The audience admired him, but the modest woman watched with a different feeling, not awe, but recognition, faint and distant like a forgotten dream. More performers took their turns, each trying to impress the maestro. Some played too loudly, others too dramatically, but every note felt like a performance instead of a story. The modest woman felt sadness rise inside her, sadness for music that had lost its heart. Then a sudden whisper spread through the crowd. A young performer scheduled next was missing. The organizers looked worried. Someone said the child was too nervous to play and had run backstage in tears. Panic fluttered through the hall. The schedule was broken. The silence stretched awkwardly. The audience murmured, restless, annoyed. Someone joked loudly that the modest woman should take the child's place since she was doing nothing anyway. People laughed, assuming it was impossible, but the organizers, desperate and flustered, turned their eyes toward her. And in that strange, unexpected moment, the woman who everyone ignored suddenly found every face looking in her direction, though none of them knew that the piano had been waiting for her all along. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the organizers stared at the modest woman, unsure whether to ask, unsure whether she would say yes, unsure whether they were making a mistake. The suggestion had started as a joke, a cruel whisper meant to amuse the privileged spectators, but now it hung in the air like a challenge no one expected. The modest woman felt her heartbeat quicken. She looked around and saw dozens of eyes fixed on her, some amused, some irritated, some curious, and some judging. Even harder than before, one of the organizers stepped closer and asked if she would be willing to fill the empty performance slot. His voice was polite but strained. The modest woman opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. Years of silence pressed against her throat, years of hiding, years of shrinking, years of believing she no longer belonged near a piano. A group of young musicians giggled softly, expecting her to refuse, expecting her to panic, expecting her to embarrass herself. One said under her breath that the recital would become a comedy show if the modest woman touched the keys. The audience began to murmur, restless and uncomfortable. The maestro sat still, his expression unreadable, his eyes watching the scene with a cold, assessing gaze. The modest woman finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. She said she could play if they truly needed someone. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some people shook their heads. Others rolled their eyes. A man in the front row crossed his arms and muttered that this would ruin the evening. The organizer, with no other option, led her toward the stage. The walk felt long, like crossing a bridge between two worlds. Her steps echoed softly, but inside her chest, memories echoed louder, memories of recitals long ago, of applause, of warm light, of a younger version of herself who believed music belonged to her. she reached the stairs, and her hand trembled slightly as she touched the railing. The stage floor felt smooth beneath her shoes. She approached the piano, a grand black instrument glowing under the lights, the same piano she once dreamed about playing again. She sat down slowly, the bench firm and familiar, her fingers hovered above the keys, not touching yet, just remembering. The audience whispered again, but this time the noise sounded nervous. The modest woman closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in, breathing out, letting the world fall away, letting the noise dissolve, letting her heart find stillness. She opened her eyes and placed her fingers gently on the keys. The hall grew quiet, even the whispers faded. The maestro leaned forward slightly, sensing something he could not explain. The modest woman played the first note, and the sound floated into the air like a breath of warm wind, soft but full, gentle but alive. The audience froze, their eyes widened, their mouths parted without sound. She played again and again, and suddenly the room was wrapped in a melody that felt like morning. Sunlight touching cold windows, a melody that carried sorrow, hope, longing, and quiet strength. Her hands moved with grace, not rushed, not forced. Each note felt like a memory unfolding, each chord like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. The young musicians who mocked her sat motionless, their pride melting into disbelief. The wealthy mothers who laughed now stared with trembling chins. The glittering woman who insulted her earlier clutched her necklace, unable to blink. The music deepened, rising like a soft tide, filling every corner of the hall. The maestro's eyes widened slowly, his breathing changed, his head tilted, his expression softened. He recognized something rare, something precious, something he had searched for in countless students but never found. The modest woman played not with perfection, but with soul. Every note carried truth, every phrase carried emotion born from life, loss, love, silence, and healing. When she reached the final notes, the room felt suspended, as if the world itself forgot how to move. She lifted her hands slowly from the keys, and for a long moment no one breathed, no one moved, no one clapped. They simply sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed, shaken, transformed. Then, like a wave breaking, the applause erupted, loud, fierce, unstoppable. People rose to their feet, tears in their eyes, hands trembling as they clapped. The young performers stared at her with awe instead of arrogance. The wealthy parents forgot their pride and clapped like children. The organizer looked relieved and amazed. But the maestro, the strict, unshakable maestro, rose slowly from his seat, his eyes fixed on the modest woman, his expression not shocked, but deeply moved. And in that moment, the entire hall waited to see what he would do next, because his reaction would define the moment forever. The maestro stepped forward slowly, his footsteps echoing through the silent hall. The applause softened, then faded completely as everyone watched him. The modest woman stayed seated at the piano bench, her hands resting gently in her lap, her eyes lowered, not out of fear, but out of humility. She had not played for praise, she had played because something inside her finally opened after years of being locked away. The maestro stopped beside the piano and looked at her, really looked, as if trying to recognize a memory buried deep in time. The audience held their breath, unsure whether he would scold her or applaud her. His reputation was sharp, unforgiving, and his approval was rare. Suddenly he asked her name. His voice was soft, but it carried through the entire room. The modest woman hesitated, then spoke her name quietly. The maestro repeated it slowly, as if tasting it, as if hearing an echo from long ago. A gasp came from someone in the second row. A woman whispered that she remembered that name from an old competition. A prodigy who disappeared before she turned 20. Rumors spread like wind. Some said she had been promised a brilliant future. Some said she once played on international stages. Some said tragedy stole her music. Whispers grew thicker, but the modest woman sat still, her gaze fixed gently on the piano keys. The maestro asked her where she had been all these years, and the room leaned in to hear. She answered quietly, saying life had taken her away from music, not by choice, but by circumstances too heavy for her hands to carry. She spoke of family responsibilities, illness, loss, and survival, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. The maestro listened, and something softened in his stern expression. He turned to the audience and said that technique could be taught, speed could be trained, posture could be corrected, but soul could not be manufactured. He said the modest woman played with something none of his top students possessed, life. The audience murmured, touched and humbled. The maestro then asked her to play again, not for the audience, not for approval, but for him. The hall fell into a hush once more. The modest woman hesitated, unsure if she should, unsure if her heart could open that wide again. But something inside her shifted, a gentle courage. She placed her hands on the keys once more. This time the melody was softer, like a memory whispered through sunlight. The maestro closed his eyes, and some audience members did too, letting the music wash through them like warmth after a winter storm. When she finished, The maestro placed his hand on the piano as if honoring it, then turned to the crowd and declared that she was the finest musician in the room. Gasps swept through the hall. Several performers lowered their heads, realizing their pride had blinded them. Parents who bragged about years of expensive lessons now felt small in comparison to the quiet woman they had dismissed. The maestro asked her if she would consider performing again, not professionally if she didn't wish, but simply to keep her gift alive. The modest woman looked uncertain, years of silence still clinging to her like dust. She said she did not know if she belonged on a stage anymore. The maestro shook his head and said belonging was not granted by others, it was claimed by the heart. He then turned to the organizers and instructed them to ensure she always had a seat reserved, not in the back but wherever she wished to sit. People stared in amazement. The same audience that ignored her now looked at her with reverence, admiration, and even guilt. The modest woman stood slowly from the bench, unsure what to do next, unsure how to absorb so much attention after so many years of being unseen. The maestro offered his hand to escort her down the stage stairs, and she accepted, not out of vanity but out of gratitude. As she walked back through the aisle, the audience stood again applauding her gently this time, not loudly, not fiercely, but respectfully. Many had tears in their eyes. The young performers who mocked her earlier stepped aside with lowered heads. The glittering woman who questioned her belonging could not even meet her gaze. The modest woman returned to her seat, but now the chair felt different. The world had shifted, and though she sat quietly again, she no longer felt like a shadow in the room. She felt like someone who had awakened a truth the hall had forgotten. And the night was not finished yet, because the greatest surprise was still waiting to unfold in part 5. The recital moved forward, but nothing felt the same anymore. The audience kept glancing toward the modest woman, still trying to understand how someone so quiet, so overlooked, could play with such depth and emotion. The performers who followed her walked onto the stage with trembling hands. Their confidence had cracked, their fingers hesitated, their music sounded careful instead of proud. The maestro listened politely, but his expression no longer showed interest. His mind was still on the melody she played, the one that stirred something old and forgotten inside him. Meanwhile, the modest woman sat in her seat, feeling the weight of so many eyes. She looked down at her hands, surprised at how steady they felt. She expected to shake, expected to feel overwhelmed, but instead she felt a warm calmness, like a door inside her had opened again after being locked for years. A pair of elderly music teachers sitting nearby leaned toward her and asked softly where she learned to play. The modest woman answered gently that she learned in her childhood, that music once filled her life every day. The teachers looked at her with admiration, saying they had never heard such purity in tone. Others began to gather around her during the short break. A young pianist asked how she made the music sound like it was breathing. A mother asked if she taught lessons. A teenager with shy eyes asked how to play without fear. The modest woman tried to answer each question, speaking kindly, telling them that music was not about perfection but honesty, not about speed but emotion, not about applause but connection. Her words spread quietly through the crowd, reaching people who had never thought about music that way. The glittering woman who mocked her earlier approached slowly, her face flushed with shame. She apologized in a small voice, saying she should not have judged someone by clothing or seat choice. The modest woman accepted the apology gracefully, not holding anger because she understood that some people learn only when their assumptions break. At that moment the maestro approached her again. The room grew silent. Even though no announcement had been made, his presence commanded attention. He asked her if she would stay after the recital so he could speak with her privately. She nodded, unsure of what he wanted, unsure if she was ready for whatever was coming. The recital resumed and the remaining performers played, but the audience listened differently now. Their ears searched for soul, for feeling, for truth, and many realized how rare it was. When the final performer finished, the audience clapped politely, but everyone knew the highlight of the night had already passed. The organizers stepped forward and announced a short closing, thanking the participants, praising the event, but their voices lacked the usual excitement, because everyone was still thinking about her. As people began to gather their coats and programs, small groups continued discussing the modest woman's performance. Some said it felt like the music told a story without words. Others said it felt like a memory from their childhood. One elderly man said he had not cried during music in 20 years, and tonight he felt tears. The modest woman stood slowly, preparing to leave, but the maestro gestured for her to wait. The hall emptied gradually, and soon only a small number of people remained. Watching from a respectful distance, the maestro walked with her back to the piano on stage and asked her to sit again, not to play but to talk. He asked her why she stopped performing, why she disappeared, why she hid her gift. The modest woman looked at the keys and said life had taken her away. She spoke of losing someone she loved deeply, someone who once sat beside her while she played, someone who said her music sounded like light. When that person was gone, the music felt too heavy, too painful, and she closed the piano lid. For years, the maestro listened quietly, and for the first time his stern expression softened with empathy. He told her he understood, because he too had once stopped conducting after losing someone dear. He said pain can silence music, but it can also deepen it. He asked her if she felt the music returning tonight. She nodded slowly, saying it felt like a door opened and the air flowed back in. The maestro then said something she did not expect. He told her that music like hers could heal others, not just herself. He said she did not have to return to stages or fame, but she should never let her music disappear again. The modest woman felt tears fill her eyes, not from sadness, but from release. The maestro stood and bowed his head slightly to her, a gesture he had never given to any student. The people watching gasped softly, understanding the honor they had witnessed. As she left the stage and walked toward the exit, the hall felt different, warmer, brighter, as if the building itself acknowledged her. And though she stepped back into the world quietly, everyone sensed that the night was not an ending, but a beginning, because her melody was no longer silent, and the world would never forget it again. The next morning, the modest woman woke with the melody still alive in her mind, like a soft echo that followed her into the sunlight. She sat at her small kitchen table, holding a warm cup of tea, and for the first time in many years, she felt a sense of quiet excitement instead of emptiness. She thought about the recital, the audience, the stunned faces, the applause, and the maestro's unexpected kindness. It all felt unreal, like a dream she never asked for but somehow stepped into. She wondered if she should return to her ordinary life and pretend nothing happened, or if the music that awakened last night would keep calling her back. Outside, the world moved normally. Cars passed, neighbors walked dogs, children laughed. Unaware of the transformation happening inside her, she decided to take a walk to clear her mind. As she stepped outside, she noticed something strange. A young girl from her neighborhood approached her shyly and said she saw a video online, a short clip from the recital. Someone had recorded her performance. The video had already begun spreading. The girl said people were calling her the mysterious pianist, the hidden talent, the woman who played like a story. The modest woman felt her heart flutter, not with fear, but with surprise. She continued walking and passed a cafe. Inside she saw two strangers watching the same video, discussing how someone so humble could play like that. They did not recognize her, but hearing their words made her steps slow. She realized her music was reaching people even without her presence. Later that day, the maestro called her on the phone. His voice was gentle. He asked if she was all right, if the sudden attention overwhelmed her. She said she was unsure how to feel. He told her that talent like hers cannot stay hidden forever. He invited her to visit the music academy, not as a student, but as a guest. She hesitated, but something inside encouraged her to say yes. When she arrived, students stared with curiosity. Some whispered excitedly, recognizing her from the recital. Others looked confused, wondering why a simple woman in modest clothes was being welcomed by the strict maestro himself. The maestro led her to a quiet practice room with a polished piano. He asked her to play whatever her heart wanted, not for performance, not for anyone else, just for herself. She sat down and let her fingers touch the keys again. The melody that came out was softer than before, but richer, like morning light touching dew. Students gathered outside the doorway, listening silently. Their eyes softened, their breathing slowed. They felt something their technical training never taught them. When she finished, the maestro told the students to remember what they heard. He said technique shapes sound, but life shapes music. The students bowed their heads with respect, seeing her not as a stranger, but as someone who carried wisdom they could not measure. Afterward, a timid young boy approached her, saying he loved piano but felt too afraid to play in front of people. She knelt down to his level and told him that courage is not the absence of fear, but playing anyway. Even with shaking hands, the boy smiled, feeling understood. The maestro watched the moment and realized her gift was not only in playing, but in reaching hearts. She stayed at the academy for a while, speaking to students, answering their questions, offering gentle guidance. She did not speak like a teacher, but like someone who remembered what it felt like to be small, unnoticed, and unsure. As the sun began to set, she walked home with a peaceful feeling. She no longer felt like a woman who once disappeared. She felt like someone returning to herself. Slowly, softly, bravely. When she reached her doorstep, she paused and listened. The wind carried a faint rhythm. The world seemed filled with music again. She understood then that her journey was no longer about hiding or surviving. It was about healing, sharing, and letting her melody live, not in concert halls, not in fame, but in hearts that needed it. The night sky darkened, but she did not feel alone. The music was with her again, and for the first time in years she welcomed it, knowing Part 7 would change her life even more, in ways she never imagined. The following days unfolded like gentle waves. each one bringing something unexpected into the modest woman's life. She woke every morning with the sound of music in her thoughts, not loud, but warm, like a quiet friend returning after years away. People in her neighborhood began greeting her differently, not with suspicion or indifference, but with curiosity and admiration. Someone at the market asked if she was the woman from the recital. She smiled shyly and said yes, feeling strange that strangers now recognized her. Children pointed at her with excitement, saying they wanted to learn piano someday. One elderly man told her he had stopped listening to music after his wife passed, but her melody made him want to listen again. These small encounters felt more meaningful than applause, because they showed that her music reached hearts, not just ears. One afternoon, the maestro invited her to a private rehearsal. He said he wanted her opinion on a piece his top student was preparing. She felt nervous, wondering why someone like her should give guidance to trained musicians, but she accepted, trusting the new path unfolding before her. At the rehearsal, the student played beautifully, but something was missing, something invisible but important. The maestro asked the modest woman what she thought. She hesitated, then said softly that the music sounded like notes, not feelings. The student looked surprised, then thoughtful. The maestro nodded, confirming her insight. He told the student to play again, but this time to think of something precious that had been lost. The student played once more, and this time the room softened, the melody breathed, and the modest woman felt tears rise unexpectedly. After the rehearsal, the maestro walked her through the academy, showing her classrooms, practice spaces, and framed photographs of famous musicians. He stopped at an empty wall and said he wanted to place her picture there one day. She laughed nervously, saying she was not a legend, but he replied that legends are not born on stages, they are born in moments that change people. Meanwhile, the video of her recital continued spreading, musicians shared it, teachers discussed it, and newspapers began writing about the mysterious woman who played like a forgotten master. Some reporters tried to contact her, but she politely declined interviews. She did not want fame. She wanted meaning. One evening, the maestro invited her to a small gathering of musicians. People filled the cozy room, holding violins, flutes, cellos, and classical guitars. They greeted her with genuine interest, not because of her appearance, but because of the melody that had touched them. They asked her to play again. She hesitated, the old fear tugging at her, but something inside her whispered that music was no longer a wound. It was a bridge. She sat at the piano, closed her eyes, and began to play a new melody, one she had never played before. It was gentle, like a memory being born instead of remembered. The musicians around her began to join in, softly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb the purity of the sound. A violin sang beside her, a flute rose above, a cello wrapped the notes like a warm embrace. Together they created something magical, something alive. When the final note faded, no one spoke. They simply breathed together, sharing the silence that followed. The maestro placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered that music had been waiting for her return. She went home that night feeling like her heart was glowing. She sat by the window looking at the moonlit sky and thought about the journey that brought her here, the years of silence, the pain, the loss, the humility, and now the renewal. She realized something profound. She had not been rediscovered by the world, she had rediscovered herself. And though she still lived in a modest home, wore modest clothes, and walked modest streets, she no longer felt invisible because her music existed again, and through it she existed too. Tomorrow, she sensed, would bring a choice, a crossroads, a moment that would define what her life would become, and she felt ready for it, ready for part 8, ready for the future, ready to live not as someone who once faded, but as someone who finally returned to the world with quiet, unstoppable grace. The next morning arrived with a calm breeze and soft sunlight, but the modest woman sensed that the day carried a different weight, a feeling of completion and beginning woven together. She prepared tea as she always did, yet her hands moved with a lighter rhythm, as if even ordinary movements had become part of a gentle symphony. She sat by the window and thought about the road she had walked, from silence to sound, from shadows to recognition, and she wondered what life would ask of her now. A knock came at the door, soft and respectful. She opened it to find the maestro standing outside, holding a small folder and wearing an expression that blended seriousness and warmth. He asked if he could speak with her, and she welcomed him inside, offering him tea. The maestro looked around her modest home, noticing the absence of luxury but the presence of peace. He said he came to deliver something important, something he hoped she would consider deeply. He opened the folder and revealed a written invitation for her to perform at a special concert, not a grand one, not one filled with critics and cameras, but a charity performance dedicated to healing through music. The modest woman felt her breath catch. She asked why he chose her, when so many skilled musicians could have filled the program. The maestro smiled softly and said skill was not the same as sincerity. He said her music carried something rare, something that touched hearts without trying, something that could comfort people who carried invisible pain. The modest woman looked down, feeling emotions stir inside her, part fear, part hope, part wonder. She said she was afraid to stand on a stage again, afraid the world might expect too much, afraid the wounds might reopen. The maestro replied that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand anyway. The words settled in the room like soft rain. After a long silence, she nodded, agreeing to perform, not for applause, not for glory, but because music felt alive in her again. The maestro thanked her and left, but not before saying that the world did not need perfection from her, only honesty. The day passed quietly, but her heart stayed awake. She sat at her old keyboard, touching the keys gently, letting melodies form like whispers. She practiced not with force, but with tenderness, as if reassuring the piano that they belonged to each other again. Evening arrived, and she traveled to the small concert hall. The space was intimate, filled with people who came not to judge, but to heal. Some were grieving, some were lonely, some had lost their joy. The modest woman stepped backstage and took a slow breath. The maestro approached and asked if she was ready. She said she was not, but she would play anyway. He nodded, recognizing the strength in those words. When her name was announced, the audience turned with quiet expectation. They did not know her story, but they felt something meaningful was about to unfold. She walked to the piano, her steps steady, her heart open. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys, but before she played, she closed her eyes and thought of the person she once lost, the one who believed in her music, the one who heard her before the world forgot. She whispered a silent thank you, then began to play. The melody that flowed out was unlike the one from the recital. It was deeper, warmer, filled with acceptance instead of sorrow. It carried hope, forgiveness, and renewal. The audience listened with stillness. Some cried quietly, others closed their eyes, letting the music wrap around them like a gentle embrace. Even the air seemed to soften, as if the room itself was healing. When the final note faded, silence held the hall for a long, sacred moment. Then applause rose, not loud, but full. The maestro approached her with tears in his eyes, something no one had ever seen. He said her music did what medicine and words could not. The modest woman stood and bowed, her head humbled and grateful. After the concert, people thanked her, not for performance but for comfort. She walked outside into the night air, relieved, fulfilled, transformed. The stars shone softly above her, and she felt connected to the world in a way she had not felt in years. She knew then that music would remain in her life, not as a burden, but as a gift she could share gently, quietly, freely. She walked home with a peaceful heart, aware that her journey had come full circle. She was still modest, still simple, but no longer unseen. Her melody had returned, and so had she, and though the world might forget the recital someday, it would never forget the way her music made it feel, and neither would she.